My name is Lucinda Ray, and I turned 71 2 weeks after my husband was laid to rest beneath the magnolias at St. Michael's Cemetery. I've been called composed all my life, steady, practical, not prone to dramatics. But that morning in Mr. Morrison's office, even the air felt sharp enough to cut through composure. The law firm overlooked Charleston Harbor glass gleaming against the winter sun. Everything inside smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper cold order meant to keep chaos away. I sat across from the mahogany desk, hands folded tightly on my lap, trying not to ruin the black gloves I'd kept from Robert's funeral. Beside me sat my son Calder, 42, successful, meticulous, wearing the same brand of suit his father used to wear, but none of the patience. His cufflinks caught the light as he tapped the table, impatient for what he already believed was his. Mr. Morrison adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, a small ritual of authority. Under the provisions of the Ray Family Revocable Trust, he began the Maple Harbor residence, the attached bank accounts, and all investment portfolios are to be transferred to Mr. Calder Ray. The words landed one by one, heavy and deliberate. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard correctly. Mr. Morrison continued, as if reading a weather report. In addition, Mr. Calder Ray shall receive the liquid assets totaling $5 million. Calder's posture straightened. He stopped tapping. His expression didn't change much, only the slightest lift at the corner of his mouth, a contained victory. Mr. Morrison turned a page. To Mrs. Lucinda Ray, I leave the property located on Pine Creek Road, commonly referred to as the Pine Creek Cabin, along with all personal contents therein. I stared at the man across from me. The cabin. My voice cracked. That place hasn't had electricity since the 80s. Mr. Morrison hesitated. Your husband's instructions were explicit, Mrs. Ray. The trust supersedes the original will. The division complies with the prenuptial agreement signed before your marriage and confirmed after the trust revision last year. It was as if the room tilted. Prenup. Revision. Legal terms I had once trusted my husband to understand so I wouldn't have to. Calder finally spoke. His tone was smooth, but his words burned. Dad wanted things handled responsibly, Mother. He knew I could manage the real assets. Something inside me splintered. I looked at my son, the boy who once built toy boats on the kitchen floor, and couldn't recognize him. The lawyer's pen scratched faintly against paper, an indifferent witness. When the meeting ended, Calder rose first. He buttoned his jacket, offered me a brief nod, and left without waiting. Through the window, I watched him cross the parking lot sunlight glinting off his car, as if the world itself approved of his triumph. I remained seated long after the door closed, the silence pressing against my ribs. Outside, Charleston Harbor shimmered beneath the afternoon light, calm and distant, while something in me quietly unraveled. By the time I walked out onto Meeting Street, the air smelled of salt and spring rain. Somewhere ahead, my son was driving home to my home, and I had nowhere left to go but a cabin I could barely remember. By the time the last sympathy bouquet wilted and the casseroles stopped arriving, the house had grown unnervingly quiet. The kind of silence that hums like a held breath. I moved through it carefully, collecting coffee cups, folding blankets, trying to make the space resemble something living again. Robert's slippers still sat by his recliner. The faint smell of cedar and aftershave lingered in our bedroom, like a memory unwilling to fade. Calder came by 3 days after the reading, dressed in a navy suit, though he had nowhere formal to be. He had begun wearing Robert's cufflinks, a small inheritance he never asked for, but took without question. His car idled in the driveway, long enough for me to notice he didn't want to linger. He stepped inside and scanned the living room as if assessing an investment property. Mother, he began, voice-clipped and businesslike, we need to discuss the transition. I set down the teacup I was drying. Transition? Yes. I'll be moving in within the week. I have some clients flying in to see the property. It's ideal for hosting. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. You'll be moving in, he nodded almost impatiently. It's my legal residence now. I assumed you'd prefer the cabin anyway. Quiet, simple, less to maintain. Calder, I said, steadying my voice. I've lived here for 30 years. Your father and I, this is our home. He exhaled as though I were a child, missing an obvious point. You signed a prenuptial agreement. You know how this works. You've had time to process it. I'm not asking for a fight. I'm asking for cooperation. Cooperation? The word felt surgical. I looked at him, the crisp lines of his suit, the smooth confidence, and saw none of the boy who used to fall asleep on the couch beside me while Robert worked overseas. I had raised that boy alone for most of his childhood. I'd been both mother and father while Robert sailed months at a time, designing offshore rigs in Norway and Brazil. Calder used to wait by the window for every postcard. Now he stood before me, a man who spoke in contracts and clauses as if affection could be itemized. How long? I asked quietly. He adjusted his cufflinks. A week should be enough. A week. It's generous considering. The cabin keys are in the estate folder Mr. Morrison gave you. The air seemed to thin. My hand gripped the back of a chair to stay upright. The antique clock ticked between us loud as a hammer. He glanced toward the staircase, his eyes flicking over framed photographs, birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings. For a second, something softened there, but it vanished as quickly as it came. This isn't personal, he added almost kindly. Dad trusted me to handle the assets responsibly. I'm following through on that. Not personal. The phrase echoed in the empty corners of the room. My life had become a series of transactions that apparently required no emotion. After he left, I stood at the window watching his car back down the driveway. The azaleas Robert planted years ago were just starting to bloom bright and defiant against the low stone wall. Their color made the rest of the house look lifeless. That night I wandered through the rooms, turning off lights one by one. Each switch felt like closing a small chapter of my life, our life. The kitchen, where I'd baked his birthday cakes, the study where Robert wrote me notes on yellow paper, the hallway where Calder took his first steps. Every space had weight, every object memory. When I reached the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on the comforter we'd chosen together in Savannah 20 years ago. The room was cool, though the heat was on. It struck me then, the thought so clear, it almost startled me. The house felt colder than the grave. I didn't cry. Not that night. I simply lay down and listened to the old pipes hum beneath the floorboards, counting the days I had left in the only home I'd ever built. The road to Pine Creek wound deeper into the forest than I remembered. Spanish moss hung from the oaks like tired lace, brushing the windshield as I drove. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, that peculiar mix of coast and pine that clings to the Carolina lowlands. Every few miles I told myself to turn back, though I no longer had anywhere to turn. By the time I reached the gravel lane, dusk had begun to gather in the trees. The cabin appeared like a ghost from my rearview mirror, tilted, weather-beaten, half swallowed by wild ivy. I pulled the car beside the sagging porch and killed the engine. For a moment, the silence was absolute, the kind that made even breath feel intrusive. The front steps groaned under my weight. One plank split clean down the middle. The door stuck before giving way with a sigh of dust and rot. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the sour tang of damp wood and small creatures. Raccoon prints dotted the floorboards, and in the corner, a half-collapsed armchair leaned like a wounded soldier. I set my suitcase on the table and watched a puff of dust rise, catching the weak light from the single window. This place had once been part of my beginning. Robert and I spent the first week of our marriage here long before the house in Charleston, long before Calder. The memory returned in flashes. Robert fixing a broken shutter while I burned our first dinner on the wood stove. the sound of rain drumming the tin roof while we laughed under one blanket. We had promised each other we'd come back every anniversary. We never did. Now, standing in the ruins of that promise, I could almost hear his voice echo from the past, warm teasing full of belief in a future that had already expired. I traced my hand along the window frame, paint peeling away like old skin. "You left me this," I whispered, unsure if it was anger or gratitude that tightened my throat. As darkness settled, I lit one of the candles I'd packed from home. Its glow trembled across the walls, revealing more of what I didn't want to see. Broken glass warped floorboards, nests tucked into rafters. I dragged an old rug over a dry patch of floor and laid my blanket on top. The wind sighed through the cracks, carrying the low cry of nightbirds. For dinner, I ate a single apple from the car and drank tepid water from a plastic bottle. The taste of it reminded me of hospital visits, of waiting rooms, of endings. My body ached from the drive, but it was the quiet that pressed hardest against me. No ticking clock, no refrigerator hum, just the steady pulse of the forest outside, alive and indifferent. I folded my hands not out of habit, but because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't pray for rescue. Not for comfort either. I prayed for strength to stand, to breathe, to face the days ahead without bitterness. When the candle finally guttered, I lay back on the floor and watched faint starlight slip through a hole in the roof. Somewhere in the dark, a raccoon rustled a reminder that life in its roughest forms still carried on. I pulled the blanket tighter and closed my eyes, listening to the cabin creak around me, as if it too were trying to remember how to survive. The first week at Pine Creek blurred into a rhythm of small survivals, patching leaks, sweeping raccoon droppings, learning where the rain pooled and where it didn't. I thought solitude might grant me peace, but it only sharpened what was missing. The quiet didn't heal, it amplified. By the second week, the phone calls began. At first, they were polite. Mrs. Crowley from church rang to say the ladies' luncheon had been postponed indefinitely. Her voice carried that syrupy Charleston kindness that always meant something else. Then my oldest friend Miriam left a message saying she thought it best to give me space. She'd heard I'd caused a scene during the reading of the will throwing papers, shouting. None of it was true. I had barely spoken at all. The next Sunday, I put on my best black dress and drove to service anyway. The church had been my anchor for decades. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and whispered greetings. As I walked down the aisle, I caught fragments of conversation that broke off the moment I passed. Two women who used to wave from the choir looked down at their hymnals. The pew, where I usually sat third from the front left side, was mysteriously full. I ended up in the back behind a column where the light barely reached. Reverend Scott glanced my way, once hesitated, then continued as if he hadn't seen me. It wasn't cruelty, it was discomfort. And that hurt more. After service, as I lingered by the exit, hoping someone might speak, a cluster of women drifted near the door. One of them, Denise Talbot, leaned in to whisper, "Poor thing. Calder says she hasn't been well. Grief can make people act strange." Their eyes flicked toward me and then away again, as if grief were contagious. I drove home in silence, knuckles white on the steering wheel. The radio stayed off. The world had decided on a story, and I wasn't in control of the narrative. That evening, while sorting through an old box of letters, I found a glossy wedding invitation tucked between envelopes, Calder and Janelle. The wedding that never happened. The name alone made my stomach tighten. Janelle Hayes, ambitious, immaculate, a real estate broker, known for turning charm into profit. She'd been polite to me once, all teeth and perfume. When Calder ended their engagement last year, I'd assumed it was over. But in Charleston, grudges age slower than fine wine. A few days later, Miriam finally returned my call, her tone cautious. "Lucinda," she said, "I don't know what to believe. Calder came by the club. He said you've been calling lawyers threatening to contest the will. I gripped the phone so tightly, it squeaked. That's a lie. She hesitated. He looked concerned for you. He said you might need help. Help. The word carried more pity than care. I could almost hear Janelle's voice behind the script, feeding Calder the lines, dressing deceit as concern. When I hung up, I stood for a long time by the window. Outside, the pines swayed under a gray sky, whispering like a jury I couldn't reach. The hurt settled into something steadier, something that no longer trembled. The world could think what it wanted. I was done explaining myself to people who'd already decided I was mad. In that still cabin with no one left to defend me, I felt the first spark of something fierce and unfamiliar take root inside my chest. It wasn't grief anymore. It was resolve. The mornings at Pine Creek began to fall into a slow pattern. Coffee boiled over a camping stove, the hiss of rain against the tin roof, and the sound of my own thoughts filling the silence. I had stopped checking my phone for messages. The people who once filled my days had disappeared, replaced by ghosts that came calling through memory instead. One damp morning, I sat by the window with a worn photograph in my hand. Calder at 10 years old, squinting into the sun beside his father's sailboat. His hair had been lighter than his grin, missing 2 front teeth. Behind that smile was the boy I still searched for in the man who'd turned me out of my home. When Calder was born, I'd been teaching American history at the community college. I loved that job, the rhythm of chalk against board, the faces of students waking to some new understanding of the world. Robert traveled for work even then, designing underwater rigs for oil companies. When Calder turned 6, Robert began having bouts of chest pain and shortness of breath. His doctors warned him to slow down. He never did. That year, the school board offered me tenure. I should have taken it. Instead, I resigned. I told myself Calder needed stability, that Robert needed someone to manage his recovery and his moods. My mother said I was making the right choice, family first. Everyone said so. It didn't feel like a choice at all, more like the natural consequence of loving too much. Those first months at home were full of noise, Calder's laughter, Robert's coughing, the clatter of a life busy with purpose. I remember the smell of soup simmering and the piles of medical bills I organized into neat folders. Calder used to sit at the kitchen table drawing ships that looked suspiciously like the ones from his father's blueprints. He wanted to be like Robert, confident, admired, necessary. He wasn't always cruel. He was sensitive, once easily bruised by the world. When he came home from school, crying because another boy called him soft, I held him close until his sobs faded. Don't let them make you hard, I'd told him. Kindness isn't weakness. He'd nodded, but even then I could see something else flicker in his eyes, a hunger to be respected, not loved. Years later, after Robert recovered enough to travel again, that hunger deepened. Calder learned early that the world rewarded sharpness over sincerity. Robert praised him for it. He's got my mind, he'd say proudly when Calder argued his way through a debate team victory. I didn't see it then, but those words planted something dangerous, the belief that dominance was the same as success. When Robert's health worsened again, Calder was already in law school. I sold my grandmother's jewelry to cover the tuition Robert couldn't afford. I told no one. When Robert found out, he thanked me quietly, but Calder never knew. I didn't want him to feel guilty. I wanted him to fly without knowing what it cost. Now, sitting in the dim light of the cabin, I realized how invisible I'd made myself to build the world he stood on. Every decision had been made in service of someone else's dream. When Robert's firm expanded, I celebrated his promotions. When Calder graduated top of his class, I stood in the audience clapping until my palms burned. Somewhere in all that applause, I'd erased my own name. I closed my eyes and let the memory settle like dust. Regret wasn't sharp. It was dull heavy, familiar. Loving them had been easy. Loving them wisely had not. Outside, the rain eased to a whisper. I watched a shaft of light break through the clouds and touch the porch rail where the paint had long since peeled away. The forest beyond glistened green and forgiving. For the first time in weeks, I took a deep breath and let it fill my chest. The past, with all its echoes, had finally stopped demanding answers. It only asked that I remember how I'd arrived here and why I could no longer go back. The morning fog had barely lifted when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside the cabin. Visitors were rare out here. For a moment, I thought it might be Calder come to check on me, or to gloat. Instead, an old blue pickup rolled into view, its paint dulled to a weary gray. The door opened, and out stepped Silas Thorne, my nearest neighbor, if 2 miles of forest could still count as near. Silas had been part of these woods longer than the county road itself, 84 with a back bent from years of labor and a gait that carried more patience than pain. I remembered him vaguely from long ago, a friend of Robert's father who had once helped repair the well. He held a tin wrapped in cloth, warm steam, slipping from its corners. "Morning, Miss Lucinda," he said, removing his cap. "Brought you some biscuits. Figured you might not be keeping up with breakfast." I invited him in, embarrassed by the clutter I hadn't yet managed to tame. The kettle sputtered weakly on the stove as we sat at the old table. He looked around, eyes soft, but sharp, taking in the peeling walls, the patchwork repairs, the candle stubs. "Cabin's still standing. That's something he said, finally. Robert always said this place had a good foundation. Strong bones, even if the world forgets about it." I managed a faint smile. He didn't talk about it much in recent years. I thought he wanted to sell it. Silas chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh no, not Robert. He used to call this land the real family investment. I remember him saying that one evening over coffee at my place. Said folks these days only value what they can see from the street. He believed in what ran underneath." "Underneath," I repeated, puzzled. He shrugged, reaching for another biscuit. "Can't say what he meant exactly, but he was out here often. Nights mostly. Brought maps, sample jars, sometimes his old briefcase. Told me he was doing a bit of surveying, though I never saw a crew. Thought it odd, but Robert was a thoughtful sort. Always had some project in his head." His words settled over the table like dust. I tried to picture Robert here in those final years, driving out under moonlight, parking by the edge of the trees, studying maps while I waited at home, thinking he was in the city. Did he ever mention what kind of project I asked? Silas's brows furrowed. Not directly. Just said this land carried more than people realized. I assumed he meant timber value or water rights. I didn't pry. He sipped his tea, watching me with a kindness that felt almost fatherly. "Your husband was a private man, Miss Lucinda, but he cared about you, that much was plain. Maybe whatever he was doing out here, it was meant for you in the end." The notion struck me harder than I expected. For you in the end. It didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like a clue. When he left, the cabin felt different. The air seemed charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I walked outside, following the edge of the woods where the grass gave way to soft clay. The ground dipped toward a narrow creek, glinting in the morning light. I knelt beside it and noticed faint white streaks along the bank veins of quartz, threading through the soil like frozen lightning. Robert had once taken a photograph there. I remembered now, his hands covered in red dust, his smile wide as a boy's. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he'd said, showing me the stone he'd pulled from the dirt. I'd laughed then, teasing him for acting like a prospector. Standing there decades later, the memory no longer felt harmless. I pressed my palm to the rough bark of a cypress tree, grounding myself against the strange flutter of possibility that rose inside me. Grief had dulled everything these past months, but now, for the first time, curiosity cut through the fog like a blade. The woods were silent. except for the soft drip of water from the branches. I turned toward the cabin, the place I'd cursed as a punishment, and felt something shift beneath the sorrow, a quiet, deliberate pulse. Whatever Robert had hidden here, the land still kept it secret. And for reasons I couldn't yet explain, I felt ready to find it. The days after Silas's visit took on a restless energy I hadn't felt in months. His words lingered like a half-heard melody, the real family investment. They replayed in my mind as I moved through the cabin, sweeping, mending, touching each corner as though it might answer me. One morning, while trying to secure a loose floorboard near the hearth, I wedged my screwdriver under the plank and pried it up. A thin puff of dust rose, and something glinted beneath the wood. I reached down my fingers, brushing cold metal. It was a small brass key, heavier than it looked, its head engraved with the initials R.W. Robert Ray. For a long moment, I just sat on the floor, staring at it in my palm. It wasn't like the modern keys that fit the doors here. It was ornate, shaped with delicate curves, its teeth uneven, handmade perhaps. The brass had darkened with age, but when I rubbed it clean against my sleeve, it caught the firelight and shimmered faintly. I found myself whispering, "What did you leave me, Robert?" The question hung unanswered in the quiet room. There was an old trunk pushed against the wall, a heavy cedar thing that had been here since before we were married. I'd never opened it after moving in. I assumed it held tools or forgotten linens. Without knowing why, I brought the key closer to the rusted lock. The moment the metal touched the hinge, a low humming sound vibrated through the wood. It was so subtle, I might have imagined it, yet the air seemed to hum in response, the candle flame flickering as if disturbed by an unseen breath. Startled, I drew my hand back. The hum faded, but my heartbeat didn't. I tried again, holding my breath this time. The key slid into the keyhole almost willingly, though it didn't turn. It fit too perfectly for coincidence. I left it there for a second, the metal cool against my skin, and a strange calmness spread through me. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. Robert had meant for me to find it. I didn't open the trunk that night. Something told me the answer wasn't inside it, or not only inside it. The key felt like a direction, not a destination. I turned it over again, tracing the grooves around the initials, and felt a quiet conviction settle over me. The next morning, light filtered through the warped shutters, and I saw, half hidden behind the pantry door, a narrow wooden hatch leading downward. I remembered it then, the basement Robert had sealed decades ago after a storm flooded it. He'd said it was unsafe. I'd never questioned him. Now, standing before it, the warning seemed less like protection and more like a lock on a story I wasn't meant to read. I knelt, brushing away cobwebs and dirt from the latch, my fingers trembling, not from fear, but anticipation. The brass key hung from a string around my wrist, glinting softly in the thin sunlight. I felt the faintest trace of a smile forming as I whispered to myself, "Let's see what you were hiding, Robert." The air around the hatch smelled of damp earth and time. But beneath it all was something else. Something alive waiting to be found. The basement smelled of rain-soaked stone and rust, a scent like forgotten time. I hadn't been down there since Robert sealed it off, claiming the floods had made it unsafe. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight, but they held. My flashlight cut through the darkness in thin, trembling slices. Dust floated through the beam like suspended ghosts. At first, there was nothing unusual, just old crates, a rusted rake, and a stack of water-warped furniture from another life. But near the back wall, half hidden behind a shelving unit of canned goods that had expired before Calder was born, I noticed a patch of stone darker than the rest. The mortar lines looked newer, straighter, deliberate. I pushed the shelves aside, heart hammering. The movement stirred the air, releasing a faint, metallic tang. Embedded in the stone was a small steel door, barely the size of a writing box. My flashlight caught the engraving just above the keyhole RW. the same initials that shimmered on the brass key. My breath caught. I slid the key into the lock. It resisted for a moment, then turned with a soft, decisive click. The sound echoed faintly through the basement, almost musical. I hesitated, then pulled the door open. Inside was a neat stack of envelopes bound with a ribbon that had long since faded to gray. Beneath them lay a bundle of folded papers, some yellowed with age, others crisp and newer. And at the very bottom rested a sealed letter, my name written in Robert's hand, the familiar loops steady and strong. For a moment I couldn't move. His handwriting hit me harder than any memory. It was like hearing his voice again, measured exact, always certain. I carried the contents upstairs, spreading them across the table beneath the flickering light. The documents smelled faintly of cedar and ink. The first pages were deeds dated years back with survey maps attached. Lines and coordinates marked what appeared to be our property, only it wasn't just the cabin. It extended deep into the forest, nearly 200 acres. The next papers bore geological seals and technical jargon I barely understood. But even with my limited knowledge, one word leapt out again and again: quartz. Another amethyst. Mineral surveys. My hands trembled as I reached for the letter. I slid my thumb under the wax seal and unfolded it carefully. My dearest Lucinda, if you are reading this, it means you found what I could not tell you in life. I kept this land in your name through an amendment to the family trust, recorded quietly under your maiden initials. The mineral rights and everything beneath this soil belong solely to you. You once told me that patience was a kind of strength I didn't possess. You were right. I spent my life chasing progress and prestige, but you understood the quiet value of endurance, the strength to stay, to build, to wait. Calder inherited my pride. You inherited my faith. Only one of those can survive time. This land is not a burden, it is your redemption. What lies beneath will one day give you freedom, but only if you choose to use it wisely. Let Calder learn the cost of haste. Let you learn the reward of waiting. I love you beyond the years I've left. Trust that this finally was my way of putting everything right. Robert. When I finished reading, I realized my cheeks were wet. I hadn't even felt the tears coming. I folded the letter back into its envelope and pressed it to my chest. So many nights I'd cursed his silence, thinking it proof that he didn't trust me. Yet here was the truth: he'd trusted me more than anyone. Enough to leave the future in my hands, not Calder's. The bitterness that had filled me since the funeral began to ease, replaced by something steadier. Not joy. Not yet, but strength. The cabin, which once felt like punishment, now felt like possibility. The land beneath my feet pulsed with a new kind of meaning. For the first time since Robert's death, I wasn't merely surviving his choices. I was beginning to live mine. 2 days after finding Robert's letter, I drove into Charleston with the papers sealed in a manila envelope on the passenger seat. The morning light skimmed across the marshes, painting the water silver. My hands were tight on the steering wheel. I hadn't been to the city since the funeral. The streets felt sharper now, filled with people who still believed I was the widow who'd lost everything. I parked beside a modest brick office on Broad Street. The sign on the door read, "Walter Peterson, Attorney at Law Estate and Land Trusts." Silas had given me his name, saying Old Walters, the kind who still reads the fine print. Inside the office smelled of lemon polish and paper. Behind a desk, cluttered with files, sat a man in his late 60s, glasses low on his nose, gray hair combed with exact precision. He rose when I entered. "Mrs. Ray," he greeted warmly. Silas called ahead. "Said you've stumbled on something worth a look." "I'm not sure what I've stumbled on," I replied, handing him the envelope. "But my husband left me these." He motioned for me to sit, then opened the envelope with deliberate care. The next half hour passed in the rhythm of paper rustling and quiet murmurs, dates, signatures, seals. Every so often, he'd nod or make a small note. I sat still watching his expression shift from professional curiosity to something closer to astonishment. Finally, he removed his glasses. "Mrs. Ray," he said, "do you realize what you have here?" "I'm beginning to." He tapped the topmost document, the trust amendment. "Your husband separated the mineral rights from the surface estate 15 years ago. He transferred them into your name alone through a private trust clause. It's airtight, recorded, notarized, and legally distinct from any shared marital asset. That means even after his death, these rights were never part of the inheritance your son received." My breath caught. So Calder can't contest it. Not legally. The deed structure is watertight. He could make noise, of course, but it wouldn't change the law. For the first time in months, I felt the weight of fear shift just slightly off my chest. He continued flipping through the geological surveys. Now these reports remarkable. High-quality quartz veins, some amethyst indications. Nothing earth-shattering, but substantial. If extraction is handled properly, this could be quite profitable. Profitable, I repeated, tasting the word carefully. Of course, he added, there are ethics and permits to consider. Mining operations can scar land if done hastily. The state requires environmental assessments, but given your acreage and the quality of stone, you'd have leverage. You could sell the extraction rights outright or negotiate royalties over time. Royalties, I murmured. Like income. He smiled. Exactly. Monthly payments as long as production continues. With responsible management, this land could support you comfortably for the rest of your life, and then some. The phrase support you struck me harder than it should have. After months of being treated as the dependent, the forgotten widow, those words sounded almost revolutionary. Mr. Peterson leaned back in his chair. I'll file to confirm the trust record in county archives. I'd also suggest hiring an environmental consultant. If handled transparently, you'll not only keep control, but set a precedent for sustainable extraction. It's the kind of thing your husband would have respected. I nodded slowly. Robert had always admired systems clean, ordered, efficient. He would have wanted this done properly, not vindictively. Still, the thought of Calder hovered in the back of my mind. While I sat here uncovering buried wealth, he was likely parading through the city in designer suits, believing he'd won. Walter folded the papers neatly. Mrs. Ray, I've seen plenty of estates torn apart by greed. This one, though it was built with foresight. Your husband didn't just leave you land, he left you independence. I thanked him and stepped outside. The sun was higher now, glinting off the Charleston rooftops. The city noise no longer felt oppressive. It sounded alive. As I walked back to the car, I pressed Robert's letter inside my coat pocket, feeling its weight over my heart. The streets, the air, even the marsh beyond the bridge, all of it seemed to hum with quiet vindication. For the first time since the funeral, I wasn't defined by what I'd lost. I was standing on what was mine. The cabin had changed in small, deliberate ways since my visit to Mr. Peterson. A new lock on the door, a clean rug over the warped floorboards, and on the table, Robert's letter now framed beneath glass. It wasn't sentimentality, it was strategy. Every decision since that day had been made with the same steady precision my husband once used for his blueprints. When Mr. Peterson introduced me to Dr. Mara Reeves, he described her as a geologist with more sense than ego. She arrived one cool morning in a mud-splattered SUV, her hair tied in a loose braid, wearing hiking boots and a linen jacket. Her handshake was firm, her smile calm. Mrs. Ray, she said, glancing toward the woods you've been sitting on. Something extraordinary. Over the next 3 days, she moved across the property with instruments and notebooks. Her movements efficient, but almost reverent, like a person listening to a language older than words. I followed at a distance, carrying coffee and quiet questions. On the third afternoon, she joined me on the porch with soil samples laid out in glass jars. "You've got quartz." "Yes, but look here." She tilted one jar toward the light, revealing violet glimmers. "Amethyst. Fine quality." And this one, she opened another jar, green tourmaline. "Not common in this region. You're sitting on a multi-mineral vein, Mrs. Ray. If the assays confirm my readings, I'd estimate the mineral rights are worth between $10 and $15 million. Her words didn't feel real. 10 to 15 million. The number floated in the air ungraspable. I looked out at the woods, at the cypress trees draped in moss, and tried to reconcile their stillness with what she was saying. "Mining companies will be aggressive," she continued. "They'll offer to buy you out entirely. Don't. Keep a share. Royalties give you control." Control. I hadn't had that word in my life for so long it almost startled me. "I'm not interested in being rich," I said finally. "Just free." She smiled. "Then we'll make that happen quietly." Within weeks, Mr. Peterson and Dr. Reeves had arranged a meeting with a mid-sized extraction firm out of Asheville professionals, not opportunists. I let Peterson handle most of the talking, but I insisted on one condition: I would sell only 60% of the mineral rights through an option contract. The company could develop the land under my environmental terms, while I retained royalties and ownership of the rest. When the papers were signed, no champagne was opened. No announcements were made. The news would never make it to Charleston's gossip tables, and certainly not to Calder's smug circle of lawyers. That secrecy was its own satisfaction. The first royalty payment arrived 6 months later. I didn't splurge. I didn't move. I simply began to repair what was broken. Workers came discreetly from the nearby town, all paid in cash. Solar panels went up on the roof, invisible from the road. A water filtration system replaced the old well pump. The porch was rebuilt with reclaimed wood. Every improvement was modest from the outside, but solid beneath the surface. In the evenings, I would sit on that porch and watch the forest shift with the light. The same woods that once felt like exile now stood as quiet allies. I had stopped being the woman sent away to the wilderness. I had become the woman who built something inside it. Dr. Reeves visited occasionally, always bringing field notes and fresh conversation. She never asked about Calder or the fortune he believed he'd inherited. She didn't need to. The silence between us held the truth, one that didn't require vindication to feel complete. One night, as the sun sank behind the trees, the air shimmered pink against the quartz-laced soil. The land hummed faintly underfoot, as though remembering its own worth. I realized then that I didn't need anyone to witness my redemption. The world itself was enough of an audience. Power, I learned, didn't have to shout. It could whisper, and in that quiet, I had finally found my peace. It started with whispers, the kind that float between shelves and coffee counters, never loud enough to be certain, never soft enough to ignore. I was at the Saturday market picking through tomatoes when I first heard Calder's name spoken like a warning. "Did you hear about the Matthews case?" a woman murmured near the flower stand. "The firm's practically gone under. Poor man, too many risks too fast." Her companion tisked sympathetically. "And after that house he inherited, you'd think a man raised with money would know better." I turned away before they saw my face, pretending to study a basket of okra. The words came again in fragments, all morning: car leases, delinquent accounts the fiancé left. By the time I reached my car, the gossip had formed a rough shape, a story already told too many times. Calder's firm was collapsing. His name, once spoken with admiration, was now tangled in pity. The drive home felt longer than usual. The live oaks along the road seemed to lean closer, whispering the news themselves. I gripped the steering wheel and tried to quiet the surge of conflicting emotions, a sharp satisfaction I didn't want to feel, and a deeper ache I couldn't avoid. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the air heavy with the scent of wisteria. The wind chimes I'd made from Robert's old drafting keys rang softly. They had once symbolized loss. Now they sounded like perspective. By the following week, the whispers had turned to newspaper talk. The Post and Courier ran a small feature buried on page 6, Local Law Firm Faces Financial Review. The photo was of Calder, tired, unshaven, wearing the same navy suit he'd worn at the will reading. The article mentioned unpaid loans, mishandled client accounts, and an engagement quietly dissolved. I traced his picture with my thumb. The boy who once clung to my skirt at school assemblies looked nothing like the man in that photograph. Pride had built him, and pride was undoing him one public embarrassment at a time. At the grocery store, the cashier, an older woman who used to glance at me with suspicion, now spoke softly. "I saw your son in town, Mrs. Ray. Shame what's happened." He looked lost. The word clung to me on the drive back to Pine Creek. Silas stopped by that afternoon, leaving a bag of peaches on the porch. "Your boy's had a rough spell," he said gently, as though speaking of the weather. "Charleston folks always build their idols too high. Sooner or later they fall." I nodded, unsure what expression to wear. I didn't want revenge anymore, not really. I wanted understanding, but the line between them had blurred. That night, as the cabin settled into quiet, I lit a single candle on the kitchen table. Its glow reached the old documents still framed on the wall, the trust, the deeds, Robert's letter. They no longer felt like symbols of defiance, but of distance. My son had built his empire on appearances. I had rebuilt my life on silence. And somehow, both paths had led us to the same truth. Everything borrowed from pride eventually demands its debt. Outside, the wind rustled through the pine needles like the soft murmur of forgiveness, trying to find its way. I sat there until the candle burned low, thinking of Calder and the strange ache of seeing justice arrive dressed in sorrow. The rain came hard that night, drumming on the roof in wild, uneven bursts, the kind of storm that swallowed sound and made the forest disappear into darkness. I had been reading in bed when the headlights cut through the trees outside, two thin beams weaving uncertainly down the gravel path. For a moment, I froze, the old fear flickering through me like a reflex. Visitors didn't come this far after sundown. I set my book aside and listened. Then came the sound, the dull slam of a car door followed by footsteps on the porch. A pause. And then the knock. 3 times. Slow, deliberate, but shaking. I opened the door and saw Calder. He stood beneath the porch light, soaked to the bone, his suit clinging to him like a mistake he couldn't shed. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. The smell of rain and whiskey followed him. "Mom," he said, his voice splintering. I need your help." For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Water pooled at his feet, the sound of the storm filling the silence between us. I should have slammed the door. I should have sent him back to whatever mess he'd made. But instead, I stepped aside. He entered slowly, glancing around the cabin as if seeing it for the first time. The improvements, the clean walls, the solar lamp, the humming heater seemed to unsettle him. He looked smaller in this space than he ever had in the house he'd taken from me. I handed him a towel wordlessly. He rubbed his face and sat at the table, his hands trembling. "It's all gone," he said finally. "The firm, the house, everything. I thought I could fix it, but the loans." He broke off, staring at his hands, as if the answer were written there. 400,000, Mom. I'm drowning. They're foreclosing next week. The number hit me like cold air, but I didn't speak. He kept talking as though silence were unbearable. "I didn't come for money," he added quickly, though the lie was transparent. I didn't know where else to go." The clock ticked between us. I studied him, the hollow cheeks, the restless fingers, the way his pride still flickered beneath the ruin. I had seen that same stubborn light in Robert's eyes once before, It faded into regret. I see, I said softly. And the people who believed your stories. The ones who thought I'd lost my mind. He winced. Mom, please. I was angry. I thought, no, I interrupted my tone. Calm but final. You didn't think. You decided. You told lies because they made you feel righteous. And now you want the woman you humiliated to save you from the consequences. His lips trembled. I don't deserve forgiveness. I just need time. I looked at him for a long while, the rain whispering against the window. Every instinct inside me warred mother against woman love, against dignity. I remembered him as a boy, his hand in mine afraid of thunder. And now here he was, again older, but just as lost. Time, I said, at last, my voice steady. That's one thing I can give you. He looked up, confusion flashing across his face, but I said nothing more. I rose, poured him a cup of coffee, and set it in front of him. The heat curled between us like a fragile truce. Outside, the storm began to ease, the trees dripping in slow surrender. Inside, my son sat across from me, broken, silent, and finally beginning to learn what it meant to be human. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed and still. The air smelled of pine and rain, sharp and clean. Calder was asleep at the table, his head resting on folded arms, coffee, long gone cold, beside him. For a moment, watching him there, I almost saw the boy he once was, the one who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long drives home from school. But time had rewritten him, carving lines where innocence used to be. I set another cup of coffee down and waited for him to stir. When he did, he looked dazed, as if waking in a place that didn't belong to him anymore. I didn't mean to fall asleep, he mumbled. You haven't slept in a while, I said. That's obvious. He rubbed his eyes, the old arrogance gone, replaced by something raw. I've ruined everything, he said quietly. I thought I could build something of my own, something Dad would have respected, but I kept borrowing and covering losses. When the market turned, it all collapsed. The house is gone, Mom. They're taking it. I didn't respond right away. I wanted the silence to settle between us, to make room for truth. Finally, I said, You came here for help. You'll have it, but on my terms. His head lifted, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. Mom, I don't expect charity. Good, I interrupted. Because you won't get it. You'll get a loan, $500,000. Enough to pay your debts, cover your legal fees, and give you a second chance. But it comes with interest, 5% annually, 10-year repayment. You'll sign a contract before you leave this cabin. He blinked, processing the words. You'd charge your own son interest. I'd charge any adult interest, I said evenly. I'm not rescuing you, Calder. I'm giving you the dignity of accountability. He exhaled, shoulders slumping. All right, I'll pay you back. Every cent. I'm not finished. He stilled, and I continued. For the next 5 years, you'll come here every weekend. You'll help with repairs, fencing, gardening, maintenance, whatever needs doing. Not as punishment, but as work. You'll rebuild something with your own hands, even if it's just this porch. He looked toward the door, jaw tight. Manual labor. You want to make a point. I want to make a memory, I said softly. Something real, something earned. You've lived your whole life measuring worth in numbers. It's time to measure it in effort. His mouth opened as if to protest, but I wasn't finished. There's one last condition, I said. You'll write a letter to the family, the aunts, the cousins, the people you turned against me. You'll apologize for the lies you told. You'll read it aloud at the next Christmas gathering. He froze, color draining from his face. Mom, that's humiliating. No, I said quietly. It's honest. There's a difference. He rose from the chair, pacing the small room, his hands shaking slightly. You want me to stand there and tell everyone I was wrong, that I lied about my own mother? Yes. His voice cracked. You don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the slow tick of the wall clock, and the faint drip of rain outside. Then finally, Calder's shoulders dropped. He turned to face me, eyes wet but unguarded. "All right," he whispered. "I'll do it. I'll do all of it." I nodded once, not in triumph, but in quiet acknowledgement. Then I rose, walked to my desk, and opened the drawer where Robert's fountain pen still rested in its case. I placed it before him. "Sign your name," I said. He took the pen with trembling fingers. The scratch of ink across paper filled the silence, binding him not just to the agreement, but to something deeper, to consequence, to humility, to the slow work of redemption. When he finished, I slid the contract into a folder and looked up. His face was streaked with tears he hadn't tried to hide. "You'll have the money by morning," I said softly. "And coffee on the porch every Saturday. Don't be late." He gave a small, broken laugh. "Yes, ma'am." As he left to fetch his things from the car, I stood at the window, watching the sunlight spill through the pines. The storm had washed everything clean, even the path leading back to his mistakes. For the first time in years, I felt peace. Not the fragile kind that hides in silence, but the kind built from boundaries strong enough to hold love without losing self-respect. The first Saturday he came, the morning mist still clung to the trees. Calder arrived early, dressed in jeans and an old t-shirt that didn't fit the version of him the world once saw. He stood awkwardly on the porch, holding a toolbox like a man trying to remember what usefulness felt like. I handed him a paintbrush and nodded toward the fence. "Start with the north side. The boards are old, but the frame's solid." He didn't argue, just nodded, rolled up his sleeves, and began. The first few strokes were uneven, splattering more paint than they spread. He looked frustrated but kept going. I said nothing. The day passed slowly, marked by the sound of brushes creaking wood and the occasional sigh. Around noon, I brought out sandwiches and 2 mugs of coffee. We sat on the steps, the distance between us filled with silence. It wasn't cold. It was cautious, like 2 people relearning a language they once spoke fluently. He glanced at the fields. "You've done a lot with this place," he said. "I thought you'd let it fall apart." "I thought you would too," I replied. He gave a rueful smile and looked away. The honesty between us was raw but necessary. Week after week, the rhythm continued. He mended the fence, repaired the porch railing, cleared the brush along the creek bed. The work changed him in ways words couldn't. His hands grew rough, his posture steadier, his voice less performative. Each weekend, I watched the edges of pride flake off him like old paint. Sometimes, while we worked side by side, I caught glimpses of the boy. He had been the one who used to bring me wildflowers from the yard, grinning with missing teeth. Those memories had once felt like wounds. Now they felt like soft scars. By the 3rd Saturday, the awkwardness had shifted into something almost peaceful. We began sharing quiet jokes about stubborn roots or bent nails. He brought a radio one morning, playing an old jazz station while we worked. The cabin felt alive again, not because of what was being built, but because of who was finally learning how to build. During one of our breaks, Calder wiped the sweat from his brow and said, "You know, I think this fence is straighter than the one at Maple Harbor." "That's because you measured twice," I said, passing him the thermos. He chuckled, the sound soft and unfamiliar, and for a fleeting second, I saw a trace of Robert in him, his father's quiet pride when a thing was done right. Later that afternoon, while we cleaned the tools, he paused. "Mom," he said, hesitating as if stepping into dangerous territory. "How did you afford to help me? 500,000 isn't something you just have lying around." I kept my eyes on the brush I was rinsing. I managed. He frowned, studying me, waiting for an explanation that didn't come. "You didn't sell the cabin, did you?" I smiled then, just a small, knowing curve of my lips. "No, Calder. This place has already paid for itself." He looked puzzled, but he didn't press. I turned back toward the fence and we worked until dusk, our shadows stretching long across the fresh white boards. When the light began to fade, Calder packed his tools and lingered on the porch. "Same time next week." "Yes," I said simply. He gave a small nod, the kind that carried gratitude without needing words, and walked toward his car. The sound of gravel beneath his tires faded into the distance, leaving behind only the quiet hum of crickets and the scent of paint drying in the evening air. I stood there until the last glint of sun disappeared behind the trees. The fence gleamed pale against the darkening woods, strong and unbroken. It stood as proof of something neither of us dared to name yet, that rebuilding like forgiveness was never instant. It was built slowly, post by post, in the rhythm of work, shared by two hands once divided by pride. The Christmas air carried a strange stillness, that year neither joyful nor bitter, just suspended. The invitation had come from Margaret, my late husband's sister, written in her careful cursive. "We'd love to have you, Lucinda. It's been too long." I knew what she didn't say aloud, that curiosity had replaced gossip, and perhaps forgiveness was waiting for both of us. I arrived at dusk bringing a basket of sweetbread and cider. The house on Maple Harbor glowed with gold light, the same home where Robert and I had once celebrated countless holidays. Now it belonged to silence and memory. Inside, relatives clustered in soft pockets of conversation. They greeted me politely, warmer than before, but still cautious, as if they feared any wrong word might reopen an old wound. Calder stood by the fireplace wearing a simple gray sweater. No tie, no show. He looked older, not in years, but in the quiet around his eyes. When our gazes met, he gave a small nod. It was the first Christmas he had arrived before me. After dinner, Margaret gathered everyone in the sitting room, where the tree glimmered in the corner. Calder wanted to say a few words, she said gently, her voice uncertain. The room settled. I could hear the faint hum of the clock, the fire's soft crackle. Calder reached into his pocket and unfolded a sheet of paper, the same one I had seen him writing for weeks. His hands trembled, but his voice was steady. "I owe all of you the truth," he began. "When my father died, I let greed speak louder than decency. I spread lies about my mother. I said she was unstable, bitter, unfit to handle my father's affairs. I did it to protect my pride and to justify taking what wasn't mine." A ripple went through the room. No one moved. "I ruined her name," he continued, his throat tightening. "And when I thought I'd won, I lost everything that mattered. My firm, my home, my reputation, but most of all, her trust. She didn't abandon me. I abandoned her." He paused the paper, trembling in his grip. "Mom, I can't undo what I did. But I want everyone here to know she was the only one who told me the truth. And when I was at my lowest, she was the only one who opened the door." For a long moment there was no sound. Then I saw Margaret's hand move to her mouth. Tears forming. Someone sniffed. A cousin looked down ashamed. The silence wasn't judgment. It was cleansing, a kind of quiet that made space for grace. When Calder folded the paper and turned toward me, his eyes searched for something he didn't have the right to ask for yet. I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my dress. "Thank you, Calder," I said. My voice didn't tremble. That took courage. He nodded, and in that simple exchange, something heavy slipped loose between us. Not forgiveness, not entirely, but something close enough to let both of us breathe. The room exhaled. Conversation resumed in soft murmurs. Margaret hugged me for the first time in years, whispering, "We were wrong." I didn't correct her. Some lessons didn't need retelling. Later, as the fire dimmed and people drifted toward dessert, Calder sat beside me. Neither of us spoke. The flickering light caught the edge of his face, the same profile Robert once had when reflecting quietly after a storm. It was then I realized peace doesn't arrive with fanfare. It comes quietly, wearing the face of the person you thought you'd never recognize again. A year can turn a wound into a story. By the next spring, my life had settled into a quiet rhythm that no longer felt like survival. The royalties from the land had done their work discreetly. Steady payments, modest investments, no extravagance. I built a small house on the hill overlooking Charleston Bay, not grand but wide open to light. From the porch, I could see the harbor shimmer at sunrise, the same way it had when Robert first brought me there, decades ago. But this view was mine alone, now earned, not gifted. The floors smelled of fresh pine, the walls carried no ghosts, and every piece of furniture had a story of my choosing. I kept the cabin at Pine Creek, too. It became my weekend retreat, and in a way, my office. The mining company's reports arrived monthly. I reviewed them at the same worn table where I once cried over an empty bank account. Doctor. Mara Reeves still stopped by occasionally, her boots muddy, her laugh unbothered by wealth. "You've turned a forgotten corner of land into a legacy," she'd said once. I only smiled. Legacy was a word I had learned to approach with humility. Calder visited one Sunday afternoon in late May. He parked his truck at the base of the hill and walked up the path carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers, an awkward, beautiful gesture. He'd changed since that winter. Quieter, leaner, with a kind of stillness that comes only from losing pride and finding purpose. The house door was open to the breeze. "You built this?" he asked as he stepped inside, his voice tinged with awe. "With help," I said, pouring tea. "But yes, every board approved by me, every nail where I wanted it." His gaze wandered around the living room. On one wall hung a framed brass key mounted against soft linen. The initials, R.W., still glimmered faintly under the glass. He stopped in front of it. "You kept it." "I did." He looked back at me, something unspoken moving in his expression. "You never told me what it opened." I sipped my tea, watching sunlight drift across the rug. "It opened a safe," I said finally. "But more than that, it opened my eyes." He frowned slightly. "Waiting. Your father left you money," I continued. "He left me meaning. That was always the difference between what you wanted and what I needed." Calder lowered his eyes. For a long moment, the room was filled only by the soft hum of wind through the open window. Then he said quietly, "I think I'm starting to understand." "I know you are," I said. He smiled, just a small, unguarded smile that belonged more to the boy he'd been than the man he'd become. "You still go to the cabin?" "Every weekend," I replied. "It reminds me that strength doesn't come from comfort. It comes from building again, even when you thought you were finished." He nodded, glancing once more at the framed key before turning toward the porch. Outside the bay shimmered the light, scattering like 1,000 quiet blessings. When he left, I stayed by the window, watching his figure grow small against the curve of the hill. The air smelled of salt and new beginnings. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the woman who had lost a fortune. I felt like the one who had found her life. The evening light stretched long over Charleston Bay, turning the water to gold. I sat on the porch of the house on the hill, a shawl over my shoulders, a cup of chamomile cooling in my hand. The breeze was soft and steady, carrying with it the scent of salt and magnolia. Above me, wind chimes made from the old brass key caught the air and sang a low, silvery sound that seemed to hold both memory and peace. It had been nearly 2 years since Robert's death, and the world had finally settled into its rightful order. Calder had rebuilt his life quietly, without spectacle. He now worked with a local legal aid foundation, helping families in conflict pro bono mostly. He told me once that it made him feel useful again, that for the first time, I'm fixing things instead of taking them apart. I'd seen the light in his eyes when he said it, a calm I'd never seen before. He came by on Sundays now, sometimes alone, sometimes with Mara, who had become more of a friend than a consultant. They'd bring groceries or papers for me to review, and we'd sit on this same porch, talking about small things, the weather, the the tide, the stubbornness of garden vines. The subjects had grown simple, and somehow that simplicity felt like wealth. Tonight the house was quiet, only the sound of the chimes and the faint whisper of waves below. I opened my journal, its leather cover worn from years of turning pages, filled with grief, anger, then forgiveness. On a fresh sheet, I wrote the words that had been forming in my heart for months. Love built me. Boundaries saved me. The pen moved slowly, but the sentence felt eternal. Love had carried me through loss, but it was the boundaries, those painful, necessary lines that had restored me. Without them, love had been sacrifice. With them, it had become grace. As the sun sank beneath the horizon, the tide rose calm and constant, washing against the shore below the hill. The sound was rhythmic, like breathing, steady, alive, forgiving. I closed the journal and placed it beside me. The chimes swayed again, their song mingling with the wind. I watched the last glimmer of light fade from the sky and felt the quiet truth of it all settle in my chest. Nothing of worth is ever truly lost. Some things, dignity, peace, self-respect, return only when you've learned to guard them. And tonight, the world, the water, and my heart were finally still.